Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being with us here at this event, title of which is Mobilizing Finance in Developing and Emerging Markets for Clean Energy. But as we were talking with the panelists before, it's going to be really quite broader than that, not just mobilizing finance, but how we think about challenges and opportunities in developing and emerging markets. Particularly, I think we'll talk a lot about what's happening on the continent of Africa. I'm Jason Bordoff. I'm the director of the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University and co-founding dean of the Columbia Climate School. I'm really delighted to have all of you with us today for this event being put on by the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University in New York. We've all been at COP now just for about a day or two, and the overarching concern I think many of us are hearing from delegates and from policymakers is how to provide justice and prosperity for developing countries while also getting the world on track, which we are nowhere close to right now, for goals like net zero by 2050. It's a really tricky question. We just had the IEA World Energy Outlook come out that reminded us not only 800 million people around the world lack access to energy, but that number is going up, not down, reversing nearly a decade of progress, 75 million more people this year, according to the IEA, who are unable to afford basic energy services. And when you consider that per capita energy use in the US is something like 20 times what it is across the continent of Africa, this is a basic, fundamental, and moral issue, and how we think about how much energy it takes for prosperity and for industrialization, how much the developing world needs to increase its use of energy, but how we have to do that in a way that is consistent with our climate goals. Because at the same time that our energy needs are growing around the world, we know from the IPCC that to keep a roughly 2/3 chance of global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, the world as a whole has a remaining carbon budget that'll be roughly used up in around a decade or so, and we're already feeling around the world the consequences of unchecked fossil fuel use. Floods, wildfires, droughts, storms displacing millions across the world. Often those impacts themselves are worst felt in some of the countries that we'll be talking about in this session, and some of the vulnerable communities that are most struggling to adapt to the impacts of climate change. I think any just or even politically plausible path to net zero has to account for the substantial growth in energy use in the developing world. That's a major area of focus for us at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia. Countries that historically have benefited from fossil fuel consumption are increasingly being called upon to support energy growth in countries that have not, and we need to understand all the ways in which access to affordable energy is vital to maintaining support for the energy transition itself. Enabling this sort of development requires massive amounts of capital, $1 to $2 trillion a year of investment in clean energy in emerging and developing economies. In the developing world, last year we had around 150 billion. So you're talking about order of magnitude or more increase. And most of that is going to come from the private sector, not governments, although governments have a critical role to play, and we'll talk about that. We know that developed countries have so far not provided the support that is needed, not provided the $100 billion in annual climate financing promised in 2009, and that's just a rounding error compared to the kind of capital sums we need to see invested in the emerging markets and developing world. So again, at the Center on Global Energy Policy, we're doing a huge amount of work on that to lower the barriers to that flow of capital. Our scholars most recently have teamed up with the World Bank on a proposal for a currency exchange rate coverage facility that would use blended finance and carbon credits to reduce exchange rate risk, one of the barriers to investment in emerging and developing economies that we may talk about here in bankable clean energy projects. This proposal is the result of extensive research and consultation with people in commercial and multilateral finance, development policy, clean energy projects, and more. And I'm also excited to announce here at COP in Sharm el-Sheikh the launch of an exciting new program at the Center on Global Energy Policy, the Energy Opportunity Lab. It's a brand new program that we're building at Columbia that will work with vulnerable communities in the US, but also very much around the world in emerging and developing economies to expand access to energy that they need to grow their economies while maintaining our decarbonization goals. The lab will deliver on this mission by creating a multidisciplinary, multifunctional platform to expand energy access and opportunity, creating a framework to connect the world-class research we do at Columbia with operators to develop more effective and scalable solutions, and working very closely with partners to identify specific and tangible ideas that respond to environmental and market needs and empower people and communities with sustainable and accessible energy solutions. It's going to collaborate closely with a broad range of stakeholders and partners. I think you'll hear more about it in a moment. And I want to thank everyone involved in making this exciting idea a reality, including my colleagues at the Center on Global Energy Policy, and particularly the chair of our board, Matt Harris, whose $5 million philanthropic gift is helping us get this launched and get this off the ground. You'll hear more about this in the months to come, including the announcement of a stellar leadership team early next year, and I look forward to collaborating with many of the people here in how we build that. With that said, I'm really excited to delve into this topic with the issues we have in this really fantastic expert panel, each extraordinary leaders in their own right. Natalie Delapalme is the Executive Director of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. Terrier Badagashian is the Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of ARM Harith Infrastructure Fund Managers. Most importantly, the newest member of the Center on Global Energy Policy's Advisory Board. Andrew Kamau is the Principal Secretary of State, Department of Petroleum at the Ministry of Petroleum and Mining in Kenya for about 2 more weeks, after which he'll be working with us at the Center on Global Energy Policy. And really excited to hear about the things you'll be working on. And then my friend Jake Levine serves as the Chief Climate Officer of the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation. So before we start the conversation, let me quickly say this event's being webcast live, and the full video will be available online in the coming days. For those of you joining here in person, we'll have the chance at the end for some questions from the audience, although I'm sure we're going to run out of time because an hour is not enough time with this extraordinary group of experts. So let's jump right in. I guess I would just start, and maybe we'll just kind of go down the row. I'll start with you, Andrew, and come back to me. Just briefly, because we have a lot to get through. I don't want to use up all the time for this, but I'd love to hear what you are looking for in the coming 2 weeks here at this COP, what you expect to see, but more importantly, what you hope to see that maybe is not getting the attention that it should. And maybe I'll just ask you to say one or two words about that for 2 minutes, and then we'll go a little more deeply into some of the topics.
Well, Jason, thank you very much. One of the things that is, and I heard this comment yesterday, that COP has turned out to be a NATO summit. And no action, talk only. And what I want to see is people who will come out with, when you look at the contribution, the national contributions, how are they calculated? So we're going to reduce our emissions by 30%. How did we get there? How did you come to the 30%? How are you going to fund it? How are you going to provide development with that reduction in carbon emissions? And commitment from the people who are going to fund you. So how is that going to work? Those are the things that I want to see. And if it doesn't happen, what's the sanction? What's the penalty? That's what I'd like to see.
Great. Natalie.
What I'd like to see, okay, like this, is bring the needle back to Africa. And for the time being, we have the impression that it's the climate so-called global debate is mainly led by developed countries and focusing on carbon zero. Now, as Africa is a carbon net sinker, going to carbon zero doesn't mean much. So we do need to bring this balance back. And also we do need to see Africa not just as a, as Mo Ibrahim often says, a basket case to be sorted out, but a potential stakeholders that the world needs to address climate change. I mean, the role that Africa can play in addressing climate change is absolutely key, and I'll come back to that later. So bring back the needle to Africa. Thank you.
Thank you. Terrier.
Thank you, Jason, for putting this together, and it's great to be back with CGEP. I think one of the very interesting things about this COP, and I think it even commenced with last year's COP, is this increase in participation by the private sector. I think you're seeing a significant uptick in increase by the African private sector. And so one of the things I would like to see come out of this COP is not only the implementation of financial solutions and financial flows to Africa and the developing economies, but more frameworks for how to do so in partnership with the private sector.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jason, and thank you to Columbia for hosting this wonderful event. It's great to be here. So we want to do a lot of action at this COP, and I've got the CEO of DFC coming in tonight, and we've got probably 12 to 15 meetings with project developers, with financial services sector companies, with EPCs, with all of the folks on the ground who are actually going to do the work to build the projects, to get the financing in place in Africa, in emerging markets. I want to be careful about what I say because I don't want to scoop my own boss. But we've got a couple of really exciting announcements. Tomorrow at the US Center in the morning, where we're going to talk about all of the financing work that we've done in FY22. And then on Thursday, also at the US Center, where we're going to be focused particularly on adaptation and resilience, and the work that DFC is doing to drill down into the question of why aren't there not more bankable projects in adaptation? How can we get those projects? How can we build financing structures to support them and catalyze them? And how can we actually get them off the ground?
Thank you. I lead and started an institute with the word policy in its name, so I did that because I think policy matters. And I kind of want to just start maybe with some thoughts on how policy matters. Andrew, you've been a policymaker in Kenya for a long time. Tell us what moves the needle the most and what you want to see more of from leaders in the developed world, but also from leaders here on the continent of Africa.
I think policy is so important because the kind of projects we're talking about, they're 20 years, 25 years. You need certainty, sanctity of contract. You need to know that when things change or they go badly, as they've gone now in the last 12 months, we're not going to go back and say, hey, hold on a minute. We did the deal back then. It wasn't a good deal. We want a different deal now. Mm-hmm. This is where the risk comes in, and this is, I guess, where a lot of banks want enhanced credit. But it's not going to. It's the policy part of it is so key. The question is this, Jason, and I think this is what the lab that you're setting up could do, especially from a policy point of view, is what are the best policies? What works? What has worked in other places? How can we adapt that to a certain market? If you don't have that, it's the old saying, you don't know what you don't know. And I think this is where the key part comes in.
I don't want you to scoop your boss, Jake, but I'm curious what you think moves the needle the most. And I ask not to be critical, it's just the reality. We have this historic Inflation Reduction Act, nearly $400 billion of investment in clean energy in the US. What's the total budget of DFC? $8 billion or something?
It's complicated, but up to 60 billion of exposure globally.
These seem like small numbers compared to the scale of finance that's needed. So talk about what you see as the role of something like DFC and how it can most move the needle.
Yeah, 100%. Well, so at our core, our fundamental mission is to crowd in investment from the private sector, to provide tools that can de-risk investments, whether it's credit enhancement or also something like a guarantee, a political risk insurance product, project preparation. Andrew and I were talking about that on the technical assistance side, so that we're not the only player in a transaction and we're actually mobilized. Say DFC takes 20% of a transaction, you've got the remaining 80% coming from the private sector. And as we all know, there's no single government on earth, there's no group of governments on earth that can hit the $2 to $3 trillion a year that we need to tackle this crisis. So that's why I think our mission is so resonant around climate change, is because we're not going to fix this without the private sector, without bringing capital markets in to bear. But I do think Andrew raised a really important point on policy, because there are so many markets in the world where there's also not enough, the quantum of risk capital ultimately doesn't matter, because you run into a PPA regime issue or a procurement policy challenge or an expropriation risk that there's no amount of capital in the world that's going to make an investor want to come into that type of a deal. So we have some tools that can solve for those problems, but one of the things that I think is really exciting that we're working on now is partnering with the other agencies throughout the US government, USAID, the State Department, USTDA, who have these types of tools that can be brought to bear to provide government capacity to create the policy environment around which a deal can actually be successful.
Thierry, you're putting capital, trying to put capital to work on these projects, clean energy projects in Africa. I'm curious how this sounds to you, how much this would help. We hear all the time there's no bankable projects. Where are we going to find the bankable projects? What do you see as the biggest barriers to putting more capital to work for clean energy?
Yeah, thanks. In fact, we were just having this conversation outside about the finger pointing around bankable projects, because the capital providers always say there's so much capital, it's just that there are not enough bankable projects. Whereas the developers say, well, we have bankable projects, there's just no capital. And so clearly there's a disconnect, and there's a need to bridge the disconnect. And oftentimes that's done with policy, and that's done with catalytic capital. Because what we've found when we've been involved in developing projects, our fund is an infrastructure fund that invests in West Africa. And we've actually done a lot of development support for projects to take them to financial close. We've done this for toll roads, we've done this for renewable energy. And what you find is that what often is preventing a project from getting to financial close is some level of policy shift, some level of policy that can become the foundation for the credibility, foundation for payment, foundation for freedom to charge a certain tariff or to basically operate. You often also need policy to address distortions, such as a subsidy for a competing sector, for example, things like that. But the other thing that we see is the need for policy to scale. Because a lot of the time you can do a one-off bankable project where you're able to do a pilot and make it bankable. But how to drive recurring projects that are done to scale so that you can really shift the needle for climate is where you need a policy that's going to be overarching, that will then drive developers, drive companies to deliver solutions into that space. So for example, with renewable energy. And so you see that, for example, in Nigeria, we have a very robust off-grid regulatory framework that has actually driven a lot of developers into that space. But we also have catalytic capital that has come in from the World Bank and the African Development Bank. And it is that combination of policy, catalytic capital, that has allowed ARM Harris as a private fund manager to actually invest in that space. And so you basically move away from the one-off sort of small-scale impact intervention into scaling capital and scaling the private capital into those sectors that can move the dial on climate.
Natalie, I'm really curious to hear about the work you're doing at the Mo Ibrahim Foundation and how it informs your perspective on the business case for investment in Africa in particular, and how policy dependent that is, and governance challenges more broadly.
Thank you. Maybe 2 points on that. I think that policy is about making the case. When we talk about investing in renewables, policy has a responsibility in making the case for it.
Can you make it a little louder?
Can
we make her a little bit louder? Thanks.
Okay. So policy is about people also. So we need to make the case that investing in renewables in emerging markets is absolutely key. And this is probably something that's not done enough. The second point is about governance, which is probably somehow the elephant in the room, because I understand that when we talk about bankable projects, potential investors also consider the governance landscape and look at that when it comes to investing in Africa. It's true that the governance landscape, when it comes to resource-rich countries in Africa, looks a bit weak. So we need together to address that to strengthen the governance frameworks in order to attract investment. And when I'm saying governance frameworks, it's transparency of contracts, labor rights, environmental sustainability. But I would add, because once again, policy is about the people, making sure that we are upgrading the value chain. I mean, it's not only about, digging out commodities, it's about making sure that there is a local contact, making sure that there will be local processing that will create and foster opportunities for local business and local jobs, because this is a key challenge in Africa today. Last point is monitoring. I mean, I think that policy is about delivering. It can't just be pledges made at, NATO meetings. So we need, policymakers need to follow up on the pledges they have made and to make sure that what they have pledged, what they are committed to do, is efficiently and effectively implemented. Thank you.
Jason, can I jump in here?
Please.
A couple of years ago, you remember, there was a big discussion about ESG. Now all we hear is E. And Natalie makes a good point. The G is also important. The people, which is the S part of it, is very important. But you don't hear that anymore. And we heard there were trillions of dollars for ESG investment. Where did those trillions go?
Can you talk about, what was it, 4 or 5 years ago in Kenya, you set a goal for universal electricity access by, I think, this year. How is that going? And what is when we've seen how dramatically the cost of renewables have fallen, Africa's a tiny emitter, it's growing quickly, but you're still talking about, when you take a small number and multiply it, it's still not a huge number for a long time. Renewables are really cheap, so what's the problem? Why can't we just develop the continent in a zero carbon way?
No, we can develop it in a zero carbon way. But there are two different issues here. There is the social good, where you electrify as many houses as you can possibly electrify. They've got their cell phone, they've got their energy saving bulb, and the economists will tell you, why bother with these guys? You will never recoup your money by electrifying all these houses. Why do it? But the multiplier, the one that the kids now can read later into the evening, indoor pollution, higher standard of living. But the question is, because you've got the utility, and usually utilities are government-owned entities, so they've spent all this amount of money electrifying these houses. And true enough, these guys you'll never be able to recoup your money through there. And the shareholders will be asking, so why do it? The people who are the developers need a purchase agreement from PPA from the utilities. But the more people you electrify, the worse your utility does. So there is probably a difference you need to decide, is it the same commercial utility, or do you have two different utilities? One for the social good, that's on grants, and one for the commercial. And the commercial one is the one that enters into PPA agreements with these things. And then it brings me to the fact, because now we've done 75% of all households in Kenya have access to power. The problem is 80% of the people are still cooking with charcoal and firewood. So there's a disconnect there between what is affordable? SDG 7, affordable, clean energy, but what is affordable? And this is the question that we need to keep asking ourselves.
Yeah. Natalie, you've thought about this.
Yeah, because two things on renewables. When it comes to Africa, the first thing is Africa has nothing to learn about renewables. Africa is probably the continent where renewable source as a source of energy is the biggest in the world. 22 countries already use renewables as their major source of energy. When you look at the percentage of renewables in energy in Africa, it's a little bit above 47% as compared to 17% in US. Second, renewables only there is no way that renewables only can address the challenge of access to energy in Africa. Today in Africa, 600 million people still lack access to energy. 600 million people, it's twice US population, 1.3 Europe's population. very difficult to see what the Western leaders would do on climate if all their population were living in the dark. Without energy, you have no education, no health, no jobs, nothing. So we need to address this challenge of energy access, and we need to do it, of course, by speeding up renewables, but also by allowing gas as an energy transition. Gas is the less polluting of fossil fuels. Africa has gas. Africa must be helped to use African gas for African population, not just energy security for European population. This is really important. So once again, renewables, yes, we need to speed up renewables, but we need also to consider, and this is where I was talking about the balance between climate, development, and conflict, needs to be addressed. Thank you.
Yes, please go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to add a dimension to the 600 million people, the issue of gaining some access to electricity and youth. With the bulging youth population in Africa, and as the young people and the population start to have some access to energy, their aspirations grow, their migration increases, and urbanization blossoms. And so the other dimension that we face in Africa is that we're a rapidly urbanizing continent. The projections are about 50%, I think, of the population will be urban. A lot of people are going to move to the cities, and consumption is going to rise, as well as energy intensity. And so one of the challenges, I think you asked a great question, that why can't Africa just grow clean? Africa definitely has one of the greatest potential to expand and to grow with a green pathway. However, there will be pressure given the rapid urbanization, given the fact that young people are going to want higher quality jobs, because it's not just about electricity, it's going to be about electricity, jobs, higher quality jobs, and higher wages. And all of that's going to be driven by some level of industry, some level of manufacturing, and even the data, even the digital economy is driven by energy. And ultimately, a lot of young people are going to use that type of energy. So there's really a need to think through the sort of economic development that's going to underpin how Africa grows, especially with this bulging youth population and urbanization, and ensure that we start putting in those building blocks for renewable energy, for low carbon infrastructure. But the reality is that there will need to be interventions in areas that aren't always considered purely green. Example, transmission infrastructure. There's a huge need to have stronger transmission infrastructure. The Nigerian Energy Transition Plan, for example, has a great piece on mode shift transportation, because you have so many, in the urban areas, folks are just sitting in congested roads, and you've got to move them onto things like ferries, move them onto light rail. That in itself is a way to reduce that pressure of growth. And so we're going to have to think a lot more as to what that low carbon infrastructure pathway is for Africa.
Can I just ask a follow-up, Natalie? Many people who are here working on climate in their careers, attending a COP meeting like this one, will hear what you said and be worried about what it means for the carbon budget. So can you just talk a little bit about how, do you see a tension between those two things, the role of hydrocarbons in meeting Africa's energy needs, and the fact that, as I said at the outset, at our current emission levels, the carbon budget's used up in less than a decade?
Well, there is obviously a tension, but it shouldn't be there. Because once again, Africa is a net carbon sinker. So even if Africa, when Africa is developing and industrializing, the carbon emission won't be that big. And to be frank, we are talking a lot about justice, including those that are, fighting for carbon zero. But where is the justice when you have the industrialized country that are the main carbon emitters, that are obviously the only carbon emitters, that are just preventing somehow Africa to industrialize and develop because it could send some carbon in the air? So I really think that the tension is there, but it shouldn't be there. And my second point also is the fact that it's not about, there too we need to change, to move the needle. It's not about helping Africa to, address and adapt to climate change. It's once again making the best use of African resources when it comes to building a green global economy. And we shouldn't have to balance between climate and development. We shouldn't have to balance between saving the planet if it's to the expense of saving the people. We shouldn't have to take decisions that might, in the best of cases, indeed help to reach carbon zero, but will definitely lead us to miss the development goals and probably also to fuel, if I may say so, more conflict, more irregular migrations, more instability on the African continent.
Jake, I'm curious your perspective on this, and we hear more and more, I think, growing sense of resentment, concerns about hypocrisy from leaders in the developing world, looking at the response in Europe or the West to high energy prices, and then let's figure out where we can get energy we need to make it through next winter, invest in LNG projects or anything else. When you look at the role of multilateral development finance, where do you see it having the greatest impact, and how should they navigate those tensions between the energy that's needed for economic growth and the need for decarbonization?
So one of the things, Jason, that I think has set the Biden administration energy and climate policy apart is the way that it has centered environmental justice into the discussion and really used that as an organizing principle for the policy that we promulgate and for the types of financing that we do. You see this in the domestic policy and you see it internationally. From our perspective, I think one of the things that's so key is that we're listening to the communities where we're doing work and understanding what are the needs that they are telling us they have, not us imposing some need on top of communities where we do work, emerging markets, developing economies. And you'll see that reflected in the types of transactions we've done. So for example, in Sierra Leone, we proceeded with a major electrification project, which is a combined cycle natural gas project that by Western standards is tiny. It's about 83 megawatts. This will provide enough electricity to supply 25% of the grid need in Sierra Leone. And so long as we can proceed with those projects alongside our portfolio approach, which is to be net zero by the year 2040, we're thrilled to keep doing that work. At the same time, and this is really important, we are seeing competitive projects on the private market for firm, reliable, affordable, clean energy. We just invested $25 million as part of a solar and storage project in Malawi that is key to the electrification efforts there and to productive use and industry, where that country is also dealing with the aftermath of a cyclone that took out a major portion of its hydro resources. In South Africa, we've been very focused on supporting the REIPP, and although we didn't end up participating in this deal, we came close and we didn't end up doing it. I want to flag one really remarkable transaction in the RMIPP, which was a solar plus battery firm power to supply Cape Town that is going to replace a barge-based, heavy fuel oil-based generator that was not only a huge climate polluter, but also terrible for the public health of the people that were living near that facility. So it's gonna be a mix. We're gonna take our cues from the people that we work with and the people that we serve. And I think that one thing that we always ask when we're looking at a project is, who is this really benefiting? We would like to have communities, people, really benefiting from the investments that we're making, where I think sometimes we shy away from major emitting projects is where it looks like there may be a major corporation, other folks who are gonna really benefit and not pass along that profit, all of that economic development that Terry is talking about to lift up communities. Those are projects that we don't want to be involved in.
Can you just very briefly, because I want to get to other things, just say a word about how you view adaptation projects? Loss and damage obviously is high on the agenda this year at COP.
Well, I'll leave the loss and damage discussion to the negotiators. Thank you, Jason, for the opportunity to stick my foot in my mouth. But
the question was how you view DFC capital
absolutely.
for adaptation work.
Yes. Well,
Yeah.
it's an enormous priority. We recognize that as this mitigation gap is growing, so too is the adaptation gap. I just returned 2 weeks ago from a visit to Pakistan, which is a country that has been dealing with a decade of every single year serial major climate impacts, and you start to recognize the cycle of communities that can't literally get their head above water, and not just the lives that have been lost, but the livelihoods of so many millions of people and of communities that are fighting to get back on their feet. We've seen a huge opportunity to invest. Climate smart agriculture, reducing post-harvest losses with basic infrastructure like storage for food, or cold chain interventions, or tech interventions that can help farmers to understand how much fertilizer, how much water, what types of resources are they using. There's a whole host of technological, at the same time that you see these impacts, you see this wonderful proliferation of super inspiring young entrepreneurs building businesses to address these problems. And I think that we see an enormous white space for DFC. I won't preview the number that we're going to share on Thursday, but it's a big number that we did in FY22 for adaptation, and we're going to go bigger, and we need everybody's help here so that we can understand what projects there are.
Andrew, I asked earlier about what moves the needle, or what sorts of things would have the biggest impact. Maybe one way to make that more concrete is to ask what you want to spend your time on. You have 2 more weeks in government, and I announced 2 things at the outset that I'm excited about. One is the new Energy Opportunity Lab we're creating, kickstarting it with a $5 million philanthropic gift from the chair of our board, Matt Harris. I also said that you'll be working with us when you leave government at the Center on Global Energy Policy. So give me your advice on what we should be doing with that new program we're building that would make the biggest difference in the parts of the world where you've been a policymaker.
There are two areas here. There's the one side, because I knew you and I have talked about, there's the whole criticism that the West has not owned up to the 100 billion. So that's one part of it. But the converse side of it is, if the West came, if the developed world came and said, hey, listen, guys, here's $100 billion. Go and spend it. Nobody has a plan. I can tell you that. If you have a plan, let me know. But nobody has a plan of what they were going to do with the 100 billion. It's a story of the dog that's chasing the car. So you catch the car, and then what? And I think this is one of the things that at the Global Center, these are the things that we should really be considering from a policy point of view, from a map. And Natalie has given a very good discussion on their countries with critical minerals. How do they benefit? Because the energy transition is not about electrification. It's all the above. It's about electrification, it's about critical minerals, it's about value addition, it's about job creation, and these urban youth that are coming. Kenya, 65% of the population under the age of 18. They're all going to come into town. We need to build minimum 100,000 new houses every single year. We're not going to build cement plants, steel, aluminium, glass using solar. It's just not going to happen. And the alternative is even worse. If we don't build those houses, they're going to be in the slums, burning charcoal, cutting down trees, migrating through the Sahel into Italy and Greece and Spain, and there's going to be conflict. There's going to be a destabilization in these countries. The alternative is worse. So we at the center, my advice to you would be, we need to help people think through some of these issues. What are the best policies? Both from the recipient and for the people who are going to provide the funding, why should they do it? I know it's not altruism in most cases. Where it's there, great, in grants, but why does it make a difference for me to lend this money to these countries, and how can I help them make the most use of it through G and the S part of it? The E is known. That's what I think my advice to you would be.
Terry, I want to ask you the same question. I also said in the outset that you're the newest member of our advisory board, so your job is to give me advice. So I have a list of questions here, but what I always wonder about when putting something like that together is, what are we not talking about? When you come to a conference like this, when you come to sessions like this, and you speak on panels all the time, you're putting a lot of capital to work on clean energy infrastructure projects. What should a session like this be talking about that we're not talking about?
Wow. I mean, it's a fantastic conference, and I don't want to kind of highlight any gaps or failures in the conference. I think if there's one place that everything is being touched on, I would say it is the COP. So rather, I might say what is not being amplified enough. How about that diplomatic pivot? I would probably say that the area of partnership with indigenous developers, in sort of local players, is very critical, because and part of the challenge is the nature of a conference such as this, the types of folks that sort of are able to attend, and as I mentioned earlier, we're seeing a lot more private sector that's coming to this conference. But in the context of sort of the work that you're doing at the Columbia Energy Center and folks like this, is really to think about what are bottom-up solutions. What are solutions that are being designed by the folks on the ground? Because I think there's a lot of kind of high-level work that's done around, whether it's policy, whether it's technology, but how to implement that solution so that it affects people that are going to use it sort of in the cities of Nairobi, whether it's in the rural areas. I think it's one of the areas that we need to amplify a bit more, is what are the solutions that are being defined or designed by some of these young folks that are using technology, that are sort of coding solutions. I mean, I'll give you an example on productive use. I mean, there's a lot of talk about productive use and gender, so the nexus of climate and gender, the nexus of productive use and energy. And so we've invested in an off-grid platform. And that particular sponsor has been working on consumer finance for off-grid maize processing facilities as part of what they deliver. And they have all kinds of work. They're the ones sort of teaching us about how they've been delivering on productive use, and also focused on how do you do that for women in the community. So that's not a high-level policy. That's a let's do our business properly, let's address the E, let's address the S, let's address the G, but doing it from a bottom-up standpoint. So I think what I'd like to see is just us finding a lot more of those bottom-up solutions, a lot more of the practitioners that are on the ground, that are actually piloting and doing that work on the ground, and then solving for scale.
Yeah, thank you. We have, I think we have a microphone to take questions from the audience, if I'm right. There's a question in the front row. If folks could briefly introduce themselves, keep their question brief, and we'll get a few in before we conclude. Does someone have a microphone? Thank you. Thanks, Raj.
Thank you very much. My name is Bruna. I'm from Brazil. I work for a consultancy there. And my question is, first of all, thank you for the very insightful discussion on financing clean energy and emerging markets. Brazil, for example, we have a major renewable-based energy mix and power mix, and we have a huge potential for green hydrogen. But our government does not have fiscal space to give direct subsidies as we see in the US or in Europe. So how do you see, you mentioned blended finance, but at the same time we're seeing reduced amount of blended finance being directed to climate in the last few years compared to the 3 years before in the last report set out by Convergence. So how do you actually see in terms of implementation, how can we foster these projects in the emerging markets with instruments, with private capital, but also without leveraging on subsidies because we do not have space in emerging economies?
Yeah, it's a good question. You're being volunteered.
Terrier says that one's for me. Well, it's a really good question, and I think one of the other goals to answer Jason's first question that we have at this COP is to think about what a workable blended finance structure is. I think we've all probably seen about 75,000 decks with the stack, and you've got the first loss and the junior tranche and the senior tranche and the TA sidecar, and everyone sort of knows what that looks like. And there are now a few that are at work in the market, whether they're in Southeast Asia or focused on Sub-Saharan Africa, some that we've seen in South America, particularly there's a fly that's very interested in blended finance also. That I was going to say in Latin America where IDB Invest, the lab there is working on a few structures, and they've actually invested in some funds that are themselves sort of putting together a blend. And so I think we're going to get some data in the next few years about what really works. I think from our perspective, from DFC's perspective, we see ourselves as able to provide catalytic capital so long as there is the right mix coming from other financiers that is required for the particular market that we're in, which is what makes things kind of complicated. Because if you're looking at a energy access market around distributed energy resources, the needs and the risk profile is very different from what you might be looking at a utility scale, for example. And the list goes on for industrial projects, for transportation, for other business models. But I guess I would say, maybe to flip this around to you, if you're seeing something that you either need or that might work, that's something that we want to hear about from the market so that we can understand the particular characteristics of that sort of case study, as it were, and think about how we can problem solve with you. It's a very live conversation, and I think within the DFI MDB community, everybody generally agrees that there needs to be more risk capital deployed and in partnership with each other so that everybody can sort of play their own complementary role.
Sounds like a good question to add to our research agenda. So,
yes.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that, and this fiscal space issue is about the utility, because the utility is government-owned utility. But I've seen some interesting models coming out where you have special economic zones. The government wants to develop some kind of industry where you have captive power, and the risk is on the industry and not on the utility. That way, you save the state from that fiscal space.
I saw a few hands. Let me try to take a few comments and then, go ahead.
My name is Zainab Usman, Director of the Africa Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. My question is for Andrew. I thought to pick up on a point that you made that there are no plans on spending the $100 billion that was promised in 2009. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on what kinds of plans you see missing, because when I look at the African continent, at the continental level, there's the Agenda 2063. At a sectoral level, there's the Africa Mining Vision unveiled in 2009. At a country level, there are nationally determined contributions. Nigeria, in particular, unveiled an energy transition plan, which it costed at $1.9 trillion last year. So what kinds of plans do you think are missing?
That's a really, really good question. I think...
And maybe, Caitlin, if you could bring the microphone back there. There's a woman in the back row. Did you have a question? And then answer it briefly.
Okay, so there are all these they're macro plans. And this is what my first statement I said, what I would like to see. So you have the national contributions. But how did we calculate those national contributions? What are the specific projects? Are they costed? How much are they going to cost? What's the return? Who are the beneficiaries? What's the return for the investor? We need to get to the granular level. it's not enough to say we're going to build 3 gigawatts of renewables. Where? What's the fuel? Who are the beneficiaries? How is it going to be secured? Do we need credit enhancements? These are the things that I'm talking about.
Yeah. Please, yeah.
Hi, my name's Revati. I lead a nonprofit called Region Foundation, looking specifically at nature-based solutions. I also lead climate action for a group of over 2 million women members in India, and I'm from India. And I find this discussion super fascinating and very, very, very relevant. Thank you for putting this on. In my experience in India, as well as with the groups we've worked with in Africa and South America, we've experimented with philanthropic capital, as well as, outright seed funding, venture capital funding, and that sort of thing. And I find each of those fraught with risk. Philanthropic capital is too top-down, intense reporting requirements. There's not enough bottom-up sort of needs coming up. And the venture capital is too aggressive, market-focused, and not enough community involvement. So we're really trying to, practically on the ground, especially with grassroots women's groups, which is where a lot of my focus and expertise lies in, involve them in blended financing structures. And I would love to get help and advice from you all where I can actually go look them up and see which ones are worth experimenting with.
We'll get a quick answer, and if you could bring the microphone here. Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. I think you mentioned convergence. So I think convergence is a very quick one. The convergence organization specializes in blended finance solutions globally, and they have an excellent database as well as all kinds of research where they've basically spent the last maybe up to 10 years, perhaps, building out blended finance principles and themes and best practices. And you can actually double-click into the different regions, countries, players that have implemented. So even some of our projects that we've done are in that database without us even knowing. So it's a good one.
Thank you. My name is Vince Onyejeli from KPMG, Nigeria. I head the infrastructure practice. So we started the discussions talking about bankability of projects, what's bankability, and that there is a disconnect between what is classed as bankability and what isn't. So my question goes to Jake, because this would apply to DFC. So in order for us to attract the right finance in this space, I think we have to reconsider the credit rating seal that is put on some of those PRI instruments. Like I think MIGA has a BB minus. Most African countries are not going to cut that. And you're going to end up not providing that instrument, then bankability of the projects, you're not going to get it. So for me, I'm going to the granular issues now and saying this is the obstacle that needs to be removed if we want to finance clean energy in the continent. Thank you.
We'll get a brief answer and then we'll wrap up.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up, and then I have a thought. Is when you say reconsider that seal, would you propose to replace it with something else, or are you just saying we have to blow that system up?
I think my point is, just like we talked about the issue about most of the countries are maxed out in terms of their borrowing ability, this is also one that most African countries, in terms of their credit rating, are in a poor shape. So there's a disconnect, because those projects there are many projects in the continent. I mean, the lady just talked about Nigeria that's got a 1-point-something trillion plan. Nigeria's credit rating is far below the BB minus that I've talked about. So how are you going to provide the PRI to support those projects?
Well, I think it's a
very
quick answer is a bit of an offshoot of Andrew's answer to the young lady in the audience, which is we need to be working with private sector, and I think in this case with NGOs in certain cases, who can divert around that challenge. One of the examples projects that we've recently done was a debt conversion transaction in Belize. We're looking at several of these actually now in sub-Saharan Africa. And the genius of this transaction was that our political risk insurance actually bumped up the credit rating of the government of Belize, reducing the transactions costs and allowing for the new bond to be issued on an investable rating. And I think that that's a model that can be used. In that case, it was to support coastal resilience in the Belize barrier reef community. It can be used for anything. You have to identify the right stakeholders who can actually shepherd the implementation and make it work.
I'm sorry, I know we had a few hands we didn't get to. I'm told we are out of time, but please join me in thanking this fantastic panel for a really interesting discussion. And thanks to all of you for joining us. Again, the full video recording of this event will be available on the Center on Global Energy's website in a few days. We encourage you to join us for our next event in this space Thursday at 2:30 on how we turn this global energy crisis into a climate accelerator opportunity. We hope you enjoy the rest of your day and your time here at COP in the next 2 weeks. Thanks for being with us.